most of us are having an unsustainable amount of work that we're doing. And you basically set yourself up for a game that you can't win. Well, there's a way to fix that. Focus is a superpower. And if you want to do deep focus, the way I like to do that is don't forget the power of incremental progress. Daily actions, even small actions, will create a compounding situation that will pay off later. And one of the things that happens as you become more and more successful is that distractions will show up on your doorstep masquerading as opportunities.
What advice would you have for those that have maybe struggled with setting boundaries? Work-life balance is hard, and starting a business or a YouTube channel while juggling life's responsibilities can feel impossible. So in today's episode of the Think Media podcast, we're going to be learning the habits, the tips, the routines for reaching your goals faster without burning out in the process, including Michael Hyatt's 3-part framework called the productivity flywheel. So if right now you're feeling like I'm so busy, how do I get it all done? How can I be productive specifically with the challenges that are facing us today? And how can you ultimately get more done without burning out in the process? If you've never met Michael Hyatt, he is a best-selling author. He's built and scaled multiple companies, including a $250 million publishing company with over 700 employees. And recently, under his leadership, Full Focus, his company has been in the Inc. 5000 list of fastest growing companies, written multiple books that have changed my life. And so I'm excited to get wisdom today that I really believe, here's the promise. I think that spending time listening to this podcast will give you an at least 10x return on your time, energy, and productivity. So I think this will be one of the most powerful episodes. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Sean. Great to be with you. I've been a fan for a long time, and I've watched a ton of your videos, and you're doing a great job. And I feel like, why haven't we met before?
Yes. We have talked a little bit in DMs. I think I was helping you get a piece to connect the clock to your live streaming setup and some different things. And so I appreciate the love and you being a part of our community. But I want to fire just a quick question right at the top. Yep. What is one productivity tip we could implement this week to get more done?
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest one is establish hard boundaries so that you know when you start work and you know when you quit work, but it doesn't just get drug into every aspect of your life. And the thing that happened for me was when I put hard boundaries around work, because I had no boundaries. You know, I was working early in the morning from the moment I got up till late into the evening. And so things took longer than they needed to because there was no deadline. And so I think about, you know, the Friday before you go on a 1-week vacation, how enormously productive you are. And that's because you have a hard boundary, right? And so if you do that every day, where you say, I'm not starting work until, you know, my time is 9, and I'm not going to quit till 5, and I am going to quit at 5, and that's the end of the workday, then all of a sudden I look at my clock and I go, oh my gosh, I need to really focus here and get this done because I'm about out of time. And so let deadlines drive you.
So great. Okay, so you're the author of Free to Focus, and I want to unpack so many tactics related to this idea, but let's go high level. Why is focus so important in today's world or so difficult?
Well, first of all, we're enormously distracted. It's all the apps, all the gadgets, all the network of connections that we have by virtue of social media and all the rest. And we're trying to maintain those things. And I've struggled with this for years and I continue to struggle with it, but it's challenging. And we've got multi-billion-dollar companies who are investing literally billions of dollars to try to capture your attention and harness it for their advertisers. And so, it's hard when you think I'm just going to go in and check my messages on Instagram. And then you see this really entertaining, interesting reel. And then you start the scrolling and then you look down and 30 minutes later, it's like, what have I just done? So I think that's the biggest reason or the biggest challenge that we're facing right now is just these companies that are not aligned with focus. In fact, their whole model's based on distracting us and pulling us away from whatever we think is important to watch their stuff so that they can get the likes and the clicks and all the rest.
So what is your personal response to technology? It sounds like one of the main things you're talking about is phone and social media apps as being kind of public enemy number one. Is there something that you feel like is really urgent in regards to that if we want to buy back our time, get our time back?
Yeah, well, I think quarantining it is super helpful, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. But look, I'm susceptible to all the same things everybody else is. So, it's easy to get distracted in today's environment. And I love technology. And so, I've got all kinds of gadgets. I got a garage full of stuff that I've tried and not used or cycled out and all the rest. So I'm so fascinated by all that. And it's the promise, and it's an elusive promise, that if I could just get this one gadget, or if I could just get this one app, suddenly all my productivity problems will go away and I'll be completely focused. Well, as somebody who has been doing this for a very long time, that's always going to be out in front of us. I don't think there's a magic bullet. I think it really requires not only some discipline, but a lot of starting over. So you may find yourself kind of swept up into this, this current of distraction, and you just have to constantly, get out and shake yourself off and go, gosh, I just need to be awake to my life and need to be more productive and more focused. So it's focus is where we really, that's where the juice is. That's where we make the biggest gains for our companies. That's where we create the deepest connections with other people. It's where we innovate and create. And focus is a superpower. And, Cal Newport probably put it better than anybody else in his book, Deep Work. But he really talked about this idea of focus. And I was grateful to him for endorsing Free to Focus. But that's a good book for your audience to read.
So the book is Deep Work by Cal Newport. We'll make sure that's in the show notes as well. And break that down if someone's new to that concept of why that's so important now, the difference. If we're talking to knowledge workers, content creators, those that are compensated based on the creativity and quality of their ideas, and then the discipline to actually get those ideas published in a audio, written, and in this case, video. So many people listening to this, getting great YouTube videos out there that drive leads, that grow an email list, that generate direct YouTube ad revenue or affiliate marketing. For those that are maybe new to the concept of deep work, what's the difference between shallow work and deep work?
Well, shallow work is when you're just kind of doing busy work. Sometimes I call it downhill work. Where it's just easy and it becomes sort of busy work that keeps us from facing the deep work, the important work, the work that really moves our lives and our business forward. And it could be anything. It could be social media. It could be a low-level task that's just easier to get into because it doesn't really require a lot of effort, a lot of thinking. You can just start it. But there is a way to hack your brain on this. And I think the key thing if you want to do deep focus, do focused work where you're really undistracted, you're in flow, you're really being creative, and you're just kind of in the moment. But the way I like to do that is break those big, nasty, gnarly tasks down into small bite-sized pieces so that we can hack our brains into thinking, oh, this is easy. So for example, whenever I write a book, a lot of people will tell you when you write a book, you should start at the beginning and finish at the end, which totally makes sense. And actually, if you're writing a novel, that's probably how you're going to have to do it. But if you're writing a nonfiction book, what I always do is I write the easiest chapter first. Now, all of us have heard the advice of eat the frog first. I think that's really bad advice. That's like telling somebody that when they go into the gym, they should go over to the bench press and just get the maximum weight, maybe 10 pounds higher than they've ever lifted, and just try to lift it. No, you want to warm up. You'd be an idiot not to warm up first. So I do the easiest thing first as a way of hacking my brain and getting into it. So when I wrote, you mentioned Living Forward, my book on life planning, when I did that, I was in Colorado. I was deep in the mountains at about 9,500 feet. And so I was writing that book. I gave myself 30 days to write it. So I was writing roughly a chapter every 2 days or so. And I started with the easiest thing first, which was the table of contents, right? And then maybe the dedication, and then maybe the introduction. And actually, I usually write the introduction last. But I said, of all the chapters that I've got here to write that I've mapped out, which is going to be the easiest one to do? So I wrote that chapter. Okay, what's the next easiest one? So on day 29, it was a Saturday before we were going to fly out on Monday morning. And so I had one chapter to do. And it was that big, tough chapter that I had dreaded writing. But now I had momentum. I had a head of steam, and I was not going to leave Colorado without that last chapter fixed or written, because that was what it was going to take to finish the book. So the next morning I got up, it was a sunny morning. I wrote like crazy. I also had an opportunity to go fly fishing that afternoon if I finished. So I banged it out, and it was hard, but I got it done in one day, and I left Colorado with the book. Now, if I had started with that chapter, that book probably would have never been written.
Yeah, I love that idea of momentum. And I think there's another concept in like tiny habits that might have been this idea of floss one tooth.
Yes.
Because if I could get the one tooth flossed, then I might as well finish the rest. And there's something about starting maybe the easiest part of your creative process for getting a YouTube video done. How can you get the momentum started and then keep it going? You created a concept called the productivity flywheel in the book. Explain kind of what that is and how we could apply that to get focused and get stuff done quicker.
Yeah, the thing is that we have to kind of rejuvenate and make sure that we're the best version of ourselves to tackle the challenges that we're facing. And so, in there I talk about stopping a lot of things, stopping and basically giving yourself a chance to really get rested. And one of the things we know from all the sleep research is that when we're well rested, we just perform better. It's easier to focus. It's easier to be more creative. And amazingly, other people seem smarter. When we're tired, everybody seems dumber, but it ain't them. It's us. So I think we've got to stop first. We've got to sort of formulate, or design our lives. We've got to evaluate where we are in life, and then we have to rejuvenate. Then there's the cut aspect where we've got to go in and reduce our workload because most of us are containing an unsustainable or having an unsustainable amount of work that we're doing. I know when I talk to entrepreneurs, business owners, people that are trying to create a side hustle, that it's not unusual for them to have 15 to 20 things on their to-do list every day. And that's impossible. I mean, you basically set yourself up for a game that you can't win. You get up feeling overwhelmed when you look at that list. You go to bed, even if you got 8 of the 20 things done or 8 of the 15 things done, and you feel like, I totally lost it today. I mean, I didn't win. Well, there's a way to fix that. And so in this part of this flywheel, I talk about cutting, so eliminating. I talk about automating, and I talk about delegating. And they have to be done in that order because we don't want to automate what could be eliminated, and we don't want to delegate to a human stuff that we could automate. And then finally, we have to act. And the acting part of this is, to consolidate all of our work, use batching and even MegaBatching. We need to designate, come up with the idea of an ideal week, and then to activate, to execute against this life we've designed. So that's in essence it.
Wow. So unpacking this, listeners, this productivity flywheel, 3 steps. Step 1, stop. Step 2, cut. Step 3, act. What I find fascinating is 2 of the 3 steps are about slowing down and elimination. 2 of the 3 steps sound like they're about no, getting clear on your no before going really hardcore on your yes. Am I accurate with that?
Yeah, it's kind of like the other day I had to shop for a wardrobe. This was a couple months ago now for summer. We were going to do a shoot for social media and all the rest, and so I had to get some clothes. Well, the first thing that had to happen is I had to clean out my closet because there was literally no room left for more clothes. So I think sometimes we have to make the space for what we do want by eliminating what we don't want. And that's something seasonal, not one and done. This is something that has to be done on a recurring basis.
And it also fascinating that you speak like, I want to get productive today, but the first thing I might need before I get productive is a nap. Yes?
True fact.
Because you're saying if you're not rested, number one, stop, slow down, stop, get some perspective. Make sure you're also in a healthy state, healthy perspective, healthy emotions. Because if you're already burnt out and now you're just saying, how can I optimize more productivity out of this? We're already too deep. We need to slow down a little bit. Do I have it right?
Yeah, totally. I think that David Allen says you can do anything you want. You just can't do everything you want. And I think that for a lot of us, we don't see tasks as inherently unequal. Some tasks really move us toward our goals. Some tasks are critically important. Some tasks are going to leverage who we are for the benefit of our companies and for our families and for everything else we want in life. But a lot of tasks are just busy work. They don't have to be done. And yet we clutter our to-do list with all kinds of activities that don't actually move us forward. And so I think that part of being able to say no is deciding on what you want to say yes to. So I just went through an experience where I literally just came off my sabbatical, and I do a 30-day sabbatical. And honestly, this was not my best sabbatical. I got distracted. I was doing work when I had vowed not to do it. And so I just said, I looked at myself in the mirror and said, this has got to stop. I've got to set up 2025. We're recording this in 2024, but I thought I got to set up 2025 in a way where I can win. And so I want to fill in, and Dr. Stephen Covey talks about this, put the big rocks in first. So the very first thing I said to my assistant, Jim, is I said, I want us to map out 2025 now, even though it's still 6 months away, but I want to map it out now, and I want to put the big rocks in first. And so for me, what that looked like is all my vacations, my sabbatical, and then putting some guardrails around that with some non-negotiable rules, like I'm not going to work on work, and I'm just going to keep from getting sucked into the undertow of that current, which can happen to anybody, and it occasionally happens to me.
So good. Okay. And then before we move on, under ACT, you talked about batching and even mega batching. That's a first for me. Define the difference between batching and mega batching.
Well, I'm not sure there really is a difference. I mean, there's a sense in which you can, for example, you can just say, like, I want to do all my external meetings with people that want to meet with me that are outside of my company. I'm going to do all those on Friday. Or I'm going to do all my internal meetings with staff on Monday, which are two things that I do. But mega batching is when you do things like you record all your podcasts on one day or a day and a half. So I used to do this. I don't do this quite this way anymore, but I used to do it where I would record 13 episodes in a day and a half. And it was brutal. But here's the good thing about it is when you get in that headspace, and you know this from your creative work, when you get into that headspace, there's a certain amount of time that it takes to get into that space. And then you kind of get, on a roll. And it's really best if you don't stop, because then you have to, the switching cost, there's really a toll there. And so I do those 13. Usually the first one was a little bit rough. Sometimes we would come back and even re-record the first one. But by the time I got through the first one, I was on a roll. I was on fire. Now I was exhausted, but I didn't have to think about it for another quarter. That would be mega batching.
Yeah. So that strategy at the time was like a seasonal podcast, right? You did seasons. You would start, stop, but the idea is that one a week, essentially, that you got a quarter's worth of new uploads done in a day and a half.
Yeah. And I can't do that now. At least I haven't been able to yet, because now we've got an interview show. My daughter, Megan, who's the CEO of our company, we do it together, and we've been having guests on. And that's been great. But sometimes the guests, at least the guests we want to get, we pretty much have to comport with their schedule and just can't say, well, look, if you want to be on this show, you got to show up on Wednesday.
Sure. So batching, mega batching, very valuable. What are some specific tips you've learned for managing email, the requests of your time, and how you filter opportunities?
Yeah, and that's why it's, I think, so important. And where I was going with mapping out 2025 is to know the life you want, so that you can evaluate and use as a filter that against every opportunity that shows up. And one of the things that happens as you become more and more successful is that distractions will show up on your doorstep masquerading as opportunities, and they will take you off course. So in terms of managing email, I don't. So I have an executive assistant, which I highly recommend to any entrepreneur. And by the way, you don't have to have somebody full-time. You get somebody for as little as 10 hours a week or 5 hours a week. And that's exactly how I started. But I just delegate to them my inbox, and I have two separate email addresses. So the inbox, the public inbox that comes into my executive assistant, Jim, he manages those. He responds to everything he can. And then he drags into my folder, or my inbox, the other inbox, the items that he wants me to personally handle. So I go from 150 to 200 messages a day to maybe 3 or 4 or 5 messages that I need to personally respond to. In terms of saying no, the best way I know to do that, and the way I started, was I came up with a whole bunch of email templates. So let me tell you how I did it. First, I started by taking an inventory of the kind of requests I get. So I wrote down literally every kind of request I get. Like, would I be willing to serve on this nonprofit board? Would I review this book proposal? Because I used to be in, the book publishing world. Could I have lunch and pick your brain? It's a very common one. So I just said, instead of responding to that every time it happens, and kind of making it up as I go. And sometimes I'm rushed and I don't give a very warm response. And so I said, what if I could write one time the most gracious but direct email I could, and could think around where I could send them, think about where I could send them if it's not meeting with me. In other words, I want to be truly helpful. So I didn't write those templates all at once. I just wrote them. Like the next time somebody asked me to serve on a nonprofit board, for example, I pulled out that email template, was very gracious, very warm. But the magic sentence that I use in saying no is this. First of all, I give a direct and unequivocal no. So here's what doesn't count as a no. Now's not really a good time. Why don't you check back with me in 3 months? Because reality is you're probably not going to want to do it in 3 months either. So now you just kick the can down the road and you're going to have to deal with it again, which is not very efficient and, is usually disappointing to people anyway. So instead I say, look, this sounds like an amazing opportunity. I would love to do this. And then here's a magic phrase. But in order to keep my current commitments, I'm afraid I have to decline. So now I've given them an unequivocal no, right? And I've put it in the frame of due to my other commitments, because I try to live by my word. I try to, maintain my commitments, and especially commitments to my family and everything. And if I'm too busy to go visit my parents who are 90 years old, I'm too busy. So if I'm not going to visit them, and instead I'm taking an appointment with some random person I hardly know, that doesn't make sense. That's not really living by priorities. So I use that language, in order to keep my current commitments. Then what I try to do is to be helpful. And this is where the template aspect of this, maybe there's somebody else I could direct them to, or maybe there's a resource, or maybe there's something even in my own, digital library or whatever of content that I've produced. For example, somebody might say, hey, I'd love to get with you and learn how to work with an executive assistant. Well, then I could say, hey, look, I don't have time to meet with you due to my other commitments, but let me just send you a free copy of my book, Your World-Class Assistant. So, if I can do that, then that's great. They're usually delighted. And oftentimes I get a response back that says, thank you for saying no. Because most people can handle a no. What they can't handle is their email languishing in your inbox with no response. Because then they're just like, did I do something wrong? Did he even get it? There's like a whole narrative that goes on. And I just rather respond quickly, tell them the bad news, but try to be helpful. And I've never had anybody give me any blowback about that.
That's so valuable. And I think a big theme with the promise of the episode is that we're going to get more done in less time. A big way we're going to do that is by increasing our ability to say no, by stopping, cutting, so that we can act on the most important things. And so if we could better filter also inbound requests, whether that's getting into things that may or may not be a part that wouldn't require our time and focus right now. But I know for me, I have oftentimes used avoidance or maybe uncertainty or unclear priorities, thinking like, yeah, sure, why can't I do more? Or maybe I can find a way to make that work. So it's powerful to give a clear no, and then to also have language due to my other commitments because of my priorities, but then being helpful on top of that. Very valuable. And for the listeners, if you're catching that, you can do, I think this is a big tip I learned from you originally. You talked about canned responses. I know there's different email software, but Gmail has canned responses. And so at Think Media, we've tried to think about, well, if we're doing anything that's repetitious, that we do all the time in our business, that's the opportunity for a system. It's the opportunity for an email template. And then we've answered it before. Now we can have that saved and then leverage that for the next time. Am I missing anything in terms of these tactics for how we could filter opportunities and kind of get our time back?
Yeah, just another tactic. If you do have an executive assistant of some sort, then try to bounce the request to them. Jim handles all these with the same email templates himself, but he doesn't reply as me, he responds as him. He said, hey, I'm jumping in here. Michael's in the studio today, he's busy, whatever. So I'm replying on his behalf and he handles it. The truth is, Jim is it's much easier for him to say no than for me to say no. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you a good example. I got a keynote speaking request about a week ago. And the person asked me to speak at their event. And I said, man, that sounds really interesting, but you need to email Jim because Jim is the keeper of my calendar and he knows what's in play, even things that haven't showed up on the calendar yet. So Jim, it's easy for him to say no. Now, about 6 months ago, I got on a call with a guy and I thought it was about one thing and it turned out being about another. But he asked me if I could speak at his event. And the event sounded really interesting. And I said, absolutely. When is it? So I looked at my calendar myself and I committed to that event and I'm doing it for free. That's not a good thing. But sometimes I like to do that, honestly, but I would never do that if I bounced it to Jim. So if you have an assistant, use them as a buffer. I also tend to be pretty impulsive. So if you catch me at church, at coffee hour and you ask me, I'm going to probably say yes, unless I've disciplined myself And I really try to work on this, where I say, well, that sounds good, but you got to check with Jim. Or that sounds good, email me and I'll let Jim look at it and see if we can do it. So that just gives me a little buffer, between, against Dr. Covey, the stimulus and the response. That's where your freedom lies. And so if you can put a space there, even if all you can say, if you don't have an executive assistant, sounds good, let me think about it. There may be some other considerations I'm missing, but let me get back with you later this week. Just buy yourself some time, put a pause in the middle of it.
Now, I do want to drill down on this as well, because you mentioned the power of a world-class assistant. I think one of the big blocks for listeners is, I'm not ready to pay someone's full-time W-2 salary. What is the 401k and healthcare implications of this? And what would you say for the person that is doing a side hustle and they're trying to get a new business off the ground, so finances are tight, on how important is an executive assistant for the entrepreneur, visionary, creative that's driving and wanting to focus on what they're best at? How important is it? How affordable could it be? And what would be maybe the mindset blockers that some people might have, and how would you overcome those in terms of maybe this being a huge unlock of getting productivity, getting your time back?
This episode is brought to you by StreamYard. StreamYard is our go-to platform here at Think Media for live streaming to Facebook and YouTube, and for recording our video podcast. It has an incredibly easy to use interface for built-in branding, transitions, text lower thirds, and seamlessly bringing on guests. And they just added an awesome new feature called local recording. This allows you to take the quality to another level by separating out your audio and video from your guests, giving you more control over your content for later use. This feature is perfect for video and podcast creators. And so to get a special deal on StreamYard right now and to see all the features that are included, just go to streamwiththink.com. That is streamwiththink.com.
Yeah, and I really believe it is. So the first thing I would say is you've got to know the value of your time. And by that, I mean, you need to have a dollar amount. And I'll just pick a number out of the air, and the math is easy. But if you take, you make it $100,000 a year, you're paying yourself $100,000 a year, or somebody else is paying you $100,000 a year. And if you divide that by 2,000, allowing 2 weeks for vacation, basically $50 an hour. So I was leading a mastermind probably 8 years ago, and I had a bunch of entrepreneurs in the business, or in that mastermind. And one of them was talking about the fact that he's doing web design, and he's having trouble with it, but he couldn't really afford to hire somebody else to do it. Now, this guy happened to be making like, $200,000. So he's making like $100 an hour. And I said, well, let me ask you a question. This was a WordPress related issue. And he admitted he wasn't very good at it. And so I said to him, I said, how much would you be willing to pay a WordPress developer $200 an hour to do this work for you? And he said, heck no, I could probably get one for $50 an hour. I said, well, guess what? You are paying a developer, you, and one who by your own admission is not very good, premium price, $200 an hour. And I mean, the lights went off and he went, oh my gosh. I said, now the only reason I can say that is I've done that very thing. I've been penny wise and pound foolish. Now, you have to be able, if you're going to have somebody else do those lower level things that you could probably get done for, $20 to $30 an hour, if you're going to do those yourself and you've got the time to do it before you have a lot of cash flow, great. But what if you were spending that same time doing things like creating content, creating sales funnels, designing landing pages, getting more revenue? So when I started this business, Full Focus, wasn't called that at the time, but I started in 2011, and I thought, I don't need and really can't afford a virtual assistant or any kind of executive assistant, so I'm just going to continue to do it myself. Well, I was doing things that were completely, and this is another concept in Free to Focus, outside of my desire zone, my genius zone. And so I was doing things like my own email, doing my calendar, expense reports, booking my own travel. And I was terrible at it. I couldn't even find the FedEx box. I was that bad. So I decided I was going to hire somebody 10 hours a week. And I did. And that was a game changer because it freed me up 10 hours of my time. Actually, probably 20 hours a week because she was so much better at it than I was. And so that freed me up to go solicit new clients, to build funnels, to create content, which immediately multiplied my income. I mean, literally within a few months. So it was an investment to be sure, but it paid huge dividends almost immediately. And that's how I think about every hire. You know, if I can take something off my plate where I can be more focused, exert more leverage in terms of what I add to the company, and pay somebody less than it costs me to do it, I'll do that all day long for as long as I can do it.
Yeah, it's genius advice. And you have a book just on that. We'll make sure that's in the show notes as well. It's called Your World-Class Assistant, Hiring, Training, and Leveraging an Executive Assistant, part of the Focused Leader Library. Yes?
Yes. I also have a course on it.
Amazing. And so I know that for me, this has been one of those, I wanted to make videos. I wanted to do the creative work. I wanted to do the fun work. But this was the absolute, one of the key freedom vehicles was to just kind of stretch into delegation, hiring. And so powerful. Okay. You talk about front stage activities and backstage activities. Can you explain the difference?
Yeah. I want you to think of this like there's 3 different stages. It's actually only 2, but more about that in a minute. So you have your front stage. This is where the work that you're being paid to do. So if you're a financial advisor, for example, you know, basically your front stage work is meeting with the clients, doing an intake where you get all their financial goals and all that kind of stuff. But the backstage work is how you prepare for that front stage work. So if you think of a traditional theater, you know, the show is the front stage work. And so I was recently in New York with my wife and a grandson, and we went and saw Hadestown, which I highly recommend. But, you know, the performance was amazing. But what went on behind the scenes in the backstage, the rehearsals, the casting, the costuming, all that kind of stuff is what made that an extraordinary performance. But where a lot of people don't get the full picture is they don't realize that there's a life off stage. So there's front stage, backstage, and then there's off stage. And one of the things, if you talk, kind of switch the venue now, if you talk to professional athletes, it's that offstage time, that time when they're not playing the big game, where all the work happens and the rest and the recovery is critically important. Truly offstage time, not backstage, but it's off time. So for example, Tom Brady, you know, he would try to get 9 hours of rest every night, which I'd love to be able to get. I get about 7.5, shoot for 8 every night, but 9 hours, because he knows that makes him a better player. He's more focused. He's more creative. He's more in the moment, present to the game. And I think the same thing is true for us. And so I think we've got to see our own rest and rejuvenation as a strategic imperative. It's got to happen if we're going to do our best work.
If you were to unpack that as someone who's pursued that in your own life, front stage, the work you're getting paid to do, the only reason that also is world-class and gets respect and is truly excellent is if you are good at the backstage. Prior planning prevents poor performance, practice, the rehearsal, but it's a genius insight to say it's the offstage work. And I've heard that from an elite athlete level, at like the top 1%, talent's probably on par. The amount of practice is probably on par. The amount of obsession with the game is usually on par. People's recovery, that becomes one of those ways to create an unfair advantage. What have you found as a leader, also knowledge worker who's packaged what you know into different products, like a stack of biohacks, things you've tested in regards to, and just habits and routines that have helped you recover better and rest and rejuvenate better, and maybe some specific advice for the entrepreneur that is struggling, like I know I have, that sometimes it's so hard to rest and even hard to vacation and even to get into rejuvenation mode because maybe you're still dealing with some, like, I got to be doing something to be productive. Yep. And or I know some that it can be hard to even truly enjoy time off. It's like a rewiring of your brain when you've maybe pushed through the startup years and even decades of being so busy and so active and having so many plates spinning based on your own efforts. How have you got into the rejuvenation mindset, and what are maybe a stack of the things you found that really help you rest and recover better so that your on time is more effective?
Well, certainly rest, sleep is number one. And so I don't manage when I wake up, but I manage when I go to bed.
Mm.
And that's key. I know if I'm not in bed by 9 o'clock, I don't even have a shot at 8 hours. So I'm very disciplined about that. In fact, I have an alarm on my watch that goes off that reminds me at 8 o'clock that it's time to start winding down because you want to get in bed by 9. I wear an Oura ring, Oura, because that tracks all my sleep metrics. And I look at them and record them in my journal every single morning. So it's how much time I actually slept, by the way, versus how much time I was in bed. Those are two different things, right? So I monitor my REM sleep, I monitor my deep sleep, and I monitor my HRV, my heart rate variability. And I'm kind of a biohacker, so I'm really looking for this stuff, all the time. And I will do the things that will lead to rest. Like I don't want to have caffeine, for example, after about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Some people won't have it after, their morning caffeine. That's enough. I take a nap, Sean, every single day. Like before we got on with you, I've been up for about an hour, but it's just like 30 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes. And that is amazing. That really works. But I want to tell you, one of the things that I've discovered recently, and I haven't talked a lot about this publicly yet, but I also think that entrepreneurs in particular struggle a lot with anxiety. And for years, for decades, I struggled with it, but I didn't have language around it. And if somebody asked me, do you struggle with anxiety? I would say, no. What I did know was that I would have racing thoughts, that I would wake up frequently in the night, that I would sometimes catastrophize based on some recent thing that happened. And there was a lot of anxiety there. And so I think entrepreneurs of all the populations in the world probably have the most dysregulated nervous systems of any group, except perhaps people that are incarcerated. And those two groups have the highest levels of anxiety. Now, interestingly, one of my friends pointed out to me, he said, well, basically, they're one and the same. Criminals are just entrepreneurs that are doing things outside the law.
True.
Oh, that's funny. But I think for most entrepreneurs I know, and I do a lot of private coaching with, a handful of entrepreneurs. I lead 2 masterminds with entrepreneurs. But the thing with them is all of them think that their success to this point has been a fluke, that at any moment the whole thing could come crashing down, and they can catastrophize, and they can begin to think that if I'm not constantly working in my business, it's going to fall apart. So they're running from the alligator that's chasing them in their mind, and as a result, they're in fight or flight or freeze all the time. We do not do our best thinking. That part of our brain is very important. It's designed to keep us safe, but it doesn't support creative thinking or flow. It's the exact opposite. You want to be in your parasympathetic part of your brain, your executive function, where that work is going to happen. But you can't do that if you drop down to fight, flight, or freeze. So I really think, and I advocate, every entrepreneur, every person really needs to be thinking about therapy. It used to have such a big stigma, but I've done therapy for years. And more recently, I've done something called somatic experience therapy, which is basically the mind-body connection. And there's a lot of traumas that many of us carry, sometimes big traumas, being held at gunpoint or being assaulted in some way. But there's also all these little traumas that happen to us. And so our brain gets stuck in responding to those traumas, and it keeps us in a perpetual state of fight or flight. So if you've ever had a conversation with somebody and you felt like, whoa, that was a total overreaction. Well, guess what? They're not responding to you. They're responding in large part to a trauma where the pattern got imprinted in the lower parts of their brain, and it's just instinctual. They're not even thinking through it. It's just happening. And so if we can work to eliminate that anxiety, we're going to be much less motivated to try to fill everything with work, and we can really rest and be at peace. And that's something I've learned just this past year by getting the right therapist.
Any thoughts for next steps if someone says, wow, I can relate to what you're saying? I know I can. Perhaps definitely feeling fight, flight, freeze, feeling the pressure. There's the famous book from the CEO from Intel also said, only the paranoid survive. And I know that
right.
for some entrepreneurs, you want to be at peace. You want to have this internal peace like a river, but you're always like, I'm always scanning, I'm always looking what's happening in the economy, what's happening next, what's happening in the team. And you can be on that razor's edge of anxiety kind of all the time. If you want to take next steps, pursue a therapist locally, look for someone online, Google somatic if you actually want to go in deeper into that discipline. Any just thoughts on next steps for the listener that goes, I'm going to take you seriously and I want to look up a good therapist. What would you advise?
I would definitely Google that, because this is kind of all the rage in therapy right now. And there are a lot of people. I had a choice of a bunch of people in Nashville where I live and found somebody. But then I would interview, I'd pick 3 of them that seemed to, I resonate with, or, like their website or whatever. And then I would basically do a discovery call with them where I interview them, just 15 minutes. And I would just ask for their philosophy. And so I'd get them to describe that. I would also, there's a couple of other things. I would start by reading Mastin Kipp's book, Reclaim Your Nervous System. Now, he's somebody that's done deep research into I'm going to use a big word now, polyvagal theory, which is about basically how your nervous system impacts your behavior and your thinking. But he specializes in doing this for entrepreneurs. So Reclaim Your Nervous System. There are some other hacks, like some of the things that have been really useful to me is something called emotional freedom techniques, EFT, but it's tapping. And all this stuff has been, I don't buy into anything that hasn't been clinically tested, peer reviewed, double blind, all that kind of stuff. And EFT has been. And then I have an interesting device. And I told you I was a gadget guy. So I have on my wrist this thing called an Apollo Neuro. And it was designed by a guy. Have you heard of this, Sean?
Nope.
Okay. So it was designed by a guy whose name I can't remember off the top of my head, but I'll send you the link to it, to his YouTube presentation. But he's got a PhD in neuroscience, and he's also a brain physician. So he's got really the creds, and it's been really tested. But what this does is it sends vibrations in certain patterns that mimics human touch. And there's nothing that regulates your nervous system faster than human touch. This is why babies sometimes, when they're out of regulation, they just need to be held or to be hugged. Holding somebody is extremely regulating, but this mimics that. And I have an iPhone app, and the app runs the thing all day long. I run it 24/7. And so there's a power nap pattern that I can run. There's a sleep pattern. There's a joy pattern. There's, whatever it is. And it's just very subtle, very non-intrusive, but I've seen a real big difference in using that device.
Wow. We are in the depths of some very tactical things to check out. And I'll make sure that we take great notes in our show notes, talking about some of these terms, whether that's somatic therapy, EFT, this Apollo device, and some other great things. Bottom line, we are under the big category of your offstage is going to absolutely influence your front stage performance, and investing in recovery. Make sure you're getting sleep. Think about those habits and those routines, especially for high performance people. You may be struggling with anxiety, and things like therapy, some of these other tools. Rest is going to be such a big deal. Well, we have a few final questions here, and we're just talking about how do we get our focus back so we can win. We get the double win, not just at work or in our side hustles in our business, but also with our families. And so, what advice would you have for those that have maybe struggled with setting boundaries? We started the conversation there. And sometimes constraints for work-life balance. I'm newer to the family thing, 2-year-old and 4-year-old, 2 boys now, married 18 years, built this company together with my wife. Have found that sometimes the momentum of work and the calendar can just take off, as well as after this long doing it, there's so many people you want to please. You don't want to let people down. You gave us great advice on saying no. What advice do you have for setting clear boundaries for your work-life balance and maybe casting a vision? I want to say, and you will know the exact details, I heard you talking about certain goals you set for your company in terms of nights off, weekends off, even reading fiction on the weekends as more of a discipline and something that you shot for. 2 questions. What are your advice macro on some of those? And then did you start there? For those that are like, this is all impossible. Sounds nice now. You've got a virtual assistant, you've got assistants, you've got these other stuff, but I'm also in that startup phase. I'm trying to get this thing working. What do you think about the seasons of what boundaries you set? Seasons of sacrifice versus seasons of cool, nights and weekends off. I'm reading fiction. I've created the freedom to do that. Can you talk a little bit about the process of boundaries today versus maybe boundaries tomorrow that we can unlock because the business is actually prospering to a level that supports that?
Yeah, well, let me tell you a quick story. About 21 years ago, I was working at Thomas Nelson Publishers, one of the largest publishers in the country and the largest faith-based publisher. I would go on to become the CEO of that company, but at the time I was a divisional manager. And I just got this new division, which was dead last out of the 14 divisions at Thomas Nelson. It was dead last. And we were lowest profit, like we literally lost money the last year. We weren't growing. Morale was terrible. Well, I got hired to turn that division around. And honestly, I was kind of making it up as I go, but I came up with a vision, went back to the team, shared that with them. Everybody got super pumped and we worked hard. I told the CEO that it would take us 3 years to turn that division around. He thought that sounded good, but we rolled up our sleeves and we were working 60, 70, sometimes 80 hours a week. And we turned it around in a year and a half. Consequently, I got the biggest bonus check I'd ever gotten in my life. So I was super excited about that. It was more than my annual salary. I went home and I just knew that Gail, my wife, would be thrilled. Well, she looked at the check and she kind of sighed, and I could tell she wasn't her usual enthusiastic self. And she said, we need to talk. So I kind of knew what was coming, but we walked in the den and she began to tear up a little bit. And she said, you know, I'm so grateful for everything you've done for our family, but I got to tell you, you're like never here. You're traveling all the time. Even when you are home, we don't have your full attention. And she said, your 5 girls, I have 5 daughters, need you now more than ever. And then she began to cry and she just kind of choked out. She said, honestly, I feel like a single mom. Well, that was extremely frustrating to me because I knew she was right, but I also felt defensive. And I knew my team needed me, but I knew my family needed me. And I call that now the impossible choice, where you feel like you can't win in either domain. And so I hired an executive coach because I knew that if I didn't act on this, I may not have a marriage, or I may lose my kids, or I may lose my health. And so I hired an executive coach. First thing he did to me is he asked me what boundaries I'd set for myself. And I said, well, not really sure what you mean. And so he described what he meant. And I said, well, I don't really have any boundaries. And he said, would you be willing to establish some boundaries so that you can make room for your family and for your own self-care? And I said, yes. And he said, well, when are you willing to quit work at night? Because my habit at the time was I would go home, eat a quick meal with the family, pop open my laptop and get right back to work and work till everybody was in bed, and then drag myself in when Gail was already asleep. So I said, well, I'm willing to quit at 6. And he said, okay. He said, I don't care what it is. I'm just holding you accountable. So then he asked if I would work nights and weekends, and I said no. And would I work on my vacations? And I said no, because I got where he was going. But then here was the kicker. He said to me, great. Then I'm sure you won't mind if I call Gail occasionally and check in to see how you're doing. That one little thing created massive change in my life. And he did call her and checked in on me. I gave him permission, and that accountability is what I need. So I would say get a community. Even if it's 2 or 3 other people, it might be your spouse, maybe that's the wrong person, but get somebody and declare your boundaries. You can do that in the form of an ideal week, which I talk about in Free to Focus, but get your boundaries and say, I need somebody to hold me accountable. Now, at Full Focus, my company, it's a little easier to do because we have an entire community of people internally that are all committed to this. And we're constantly, like we get on people if they work too much. And the reason for that is because we know that if they work too much, they're not going to be doing their best work. And we want their best work. So we've got to, again, to quote Covey, they've got to take time to sharpen the saw if they're going to be effective in whatever they're sawing.
So powerful. Get a community, declare your boundaries with people you trust in your circle. Your spouse very well could be the person to get involved. And that accountability is a huge edge there. Well, Michael, I'm so grateful for all the advice you've been sharing. And I want to make sure this, you are such a resource, your company is a resource that our community needs. So I do have one final question for you at the end, but I do want to give you a chance to shout out some of your resources and make sure that our listeners can check these things out. The main book I wanted to talk to you about is called Free to Focus, a total productivity system to achieve more by doing less. And want to encourage listeners to check that out. That'll be in the show notes, and we'll summarize everything else there. But you have a couple things you've put together. You guys have planners, do some other resources. When thinking about those that are specifically mainly trying to get a side hustle off the ground, trying to have a startup in their garage, in their home office, in front of their computer with their smartphone, or they're tapping into what's called the creator economy and tapping into this content creation opportunity, but chipping away at it while they've got their main hustle. What are some resources you have that could be beneficial to our listeners from all the different walks of life that are listening?
Well, pretty much you can find everything at fullfocus.co, fullfocus.co. But our podcast, The Double Win, we just relaunched that. It's an interview show now. We've had Don Miller, we've had Patrick Lencioni, we've had Henry Cloud, though that one's not aired. But we're trying to talk to people, not about the things they usually talk about on podcasts, but how they've struggled with or are striving to achieve that double win where they win at work and succeed at life. And I do that with my oldest daughter, Megan. The Full Focus Planner is the heart and soul of our company. This is a paper planner that's designed to implement both our goal achievement process and our productivity systems. So we designed that planner actually for ourselves and then for our clients because we wanted sort of a daily, very tactical thing that they could use to achieve their most important goals and really make the best use of their time so that they could achieve what they wanted to achieve. So that's pretty much it.
I love it. So if you want to check that out as well as Michael Hyatt on social media, everything's in the show notes. Final question for you. Can you speak you've helped thousands of people. And I know that sometimes though, it's possible to be at a place that's almost could feel hopeless. Am I ever going to get out of just chasing my tail? I'm trying to juggle with the kids, trying to juggle at work, trying to get from feeling chronically behind, chronically stressed, and chronically overwhelmed. Any parting words of wisdom in terms of the hope that's out there? Maybe a story that if we keep chipping away at this, we can regain control of our schedule so we can both win at work and in life. Final words?
Yeah, I would say don't forget the power of incremental progress. This is kind of the law of compound interest applied to your life, but daily actions, even small actions, will create a compounding situation that will pay off later. And the challenge is to have faith that it's eventually going to pay off. And so I know when I started this business, man, it just felt like I was just trying to get that flywheel going, and it was really hard. But then it took off. But it was months where I just kept laboring, writing blog posts, recording podcast episodes, and just wasn't seeing that much. But then all of a sudden, it happened. So again, don't, how does the Bible say it? Don't despise the days of small beginnings, And so I think this is where you've got to be okay with just doing the work. Nobody like me, nobody like Sean just suddenly had overnight success. The myth of overnight success is what makes you feel that way. Everybody else, I don't care who you talk about, and we get into this with a lot of people on our podcast, is sometimes it's taking months or years to get to that next level. But if you don't take those steps, you're never going to get there. You just can't wait to win the lottery. That doesn't happen. You just got to put in the work and be faithful. And I really do think it'll happen. So, assuming you have the talent.
I love it. Michael Hyatt, acknowledge you. Thank you so much for the leader that you are and the value you've added to the world and to our podcast community today. Think Media Podcast, like, rate, share, review wherever you watch or listen. My name is Sean Cannell, your guide to building a profitable YouTube channel, and I'll catch you in the next one.